So we will begin the panel with comments from Karima.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and many thanks to the organizers for including me. It's really an honor to be here, although it's also very humbling because there are women in the audience whose work has inspired me for years, who are such leaders in this field. And I find it sort of a wonderful honor to be here with younger women who are going to be stepping into the leadership roles in the feminist movement, with women who may have been doing this work a little bit longer than I have, although as I'm getting older, I can say that about fewer and fewer people in the room, but that continuity is very inspiring. It seems to be my job these days to travel around and say politically incorrect things in a variety of settings and offend lots of people, and I'm afraid I may have been assigned that task again this morning. Because I have been given the very easy job of telling you everything you always wanted to know about Muslim fundamentalism and human rights, but were afraid to ask, and what this phenomenon means in terms of building a culture of peace, all in about 15 minutes.
Maybe 18.
So please bear with me. There will be many important things I am not able to say here. I know some of you have profound expertise on this issue, and for some of you this may be a very new issue, so I look forward to the discussion. I think I should say first how I came to this subject personally. It was not by choice. It was really by life experience. My father was from Algeria, and I spent my life back and forth between the United States and Algeria. My dad, like many people of his generation in that country, was involved in the nationalist movement, which fought for the independence of Algeria against France, and he ended up spending 4.5 years as a prisoner of war during the War of Independence. After he studied in the United States, he went back to Algeria, the now young, independent country that he had helped to liberate, and became a professor of anthropology at the university. And in the 1990s, in the terrible conflict between the military-backed government on the one hand and the armed fundamentalist groups on the other, he, like so many intellectuals, found himself in the middle. And he finally had to quit teaching at the university and even to flee his home due to death threats from these fundamentalist armed groups, including one that he found on his kitchen table when he came home that said, "Consider yourself dead." His colleagues were in fact slaughtered around him. And I think despite that horror, what was most disheartening to my father, at least it seemed this way to me, was the lack of solidarity that people like him received from the international community. And I think that part of this was due to a lack of understanding of the meaning or meanings of the phenomenon of Muslim fundamentalism, its meanings for many Muslims, and what responses the international community might offer. And so as a result of that personal experience, I have spent a great deal of my time as a professor of international human rights law, researching and writing about this topic, trying to make a small contribution towards perhaps having better responses that are more able to support those people who find themselves today in the same position that my father and his colleagues found themselves in the 1990s, whether it's in Afghanistan, Iraq, Niger, Somalia, Pakistan, or in so many other contexts. And it's for that reason that I wrote my most recent paper, with a very long title. Academics seem to always use those, which is Remembering the Others, Theorizing the Approach of International Law to Muslim Fundamentalism. And I'll try to explain the title a bit as I go along. So what I would like to do in my time this morning is to share some parts of this paper with you, especially some parts, I think, that particularly reflect on women's human rights, and then perhaps conclude with a bit of a, sorry, this is too close, isn't it? Conclude with a bit of a meditation on some of the very difficult events of the last few weeks here in the context in the United States. So I was interested when I looked at a book by very prominent feminist international lawyers, Christine Chinkin and Hilary Charlesworth, written in 2000, that they at that time argued that religious fundamentalisms, note the S, fundamentalisms, are among the most significant challenges to women's human rights, or were at that moment, and I think that remains true. Of course, it's interesting in light of comments at the earlier panel, the other of the two major threats to women's human rights that they identified were indeed the negative consequences of globalization. These two things fit together, certainly. Now, these fundamentalist movements and their adherents often claim to speak for and in the name of the things we call culture, religion, and tradition, and this, I think, raises a particular set of challenges for women's human rights, especially in this moment where, as we've discussed, everything seems to be about identity and certain kinds of identity. Now, what was interesting to me as an international human rights lawyer is, notwithstanding these profound threats to women's human rights, in my field of international human rights law, advocates and academics seem to be very reluctant to engage with these questions. They're somehow taboo. They're uncomfortable. They're embarrassing. We don't want to talk about them. And I wanted to think about why that is so. Now, you begin to see why people don't want to venture onto this terrain, I think, when you see how contested even the words we use to describe the problem, the phenomenon, are. I myself use the term fundamentalism. I recognize that it is not the only term, that it's not an unproblematic term. But why I like the term is that it really speaks across religious boundaries for me about movements within many traditions, Christian, Hindu, Jewish, among others, that are posing a variety of human rights problems. Mariameh Eli Lucas, an Algerian sociologist who founded the Network of Women Living Under Muslim Laws, defined fundamentalisms as political movements of the extreme right, which in a context of globalization manipulate religion in order to achieve their political aims. So for me, what I'm talking about here are essentially political movements. They are articulating political aims, but for the most part, exhorting the achievement of those aims using a religious discourse. And the Pakistani post-colonial theorist Saadia Abbas has described this as the radical politicization of theology. Now, contrary to frequent stereotypical assumptions that one hears, sometimes made by people with the best of intentions, this radical politicization that Abbas describes is not necessarily an inherently Muslim approach or one to which Islam or Muslim societies naturally tend. And I think I've been really disturbed about sort of the naturalization of fundamentalism in our discourse about Muslims and Islam often. But I think this is not the only difficult word or the only difficult terminology here, this question of fundamentalism. Another problem is, what do we even call the broader group of people who live on the broader front lines of this discussion and the places they live? I think almost no academic would think of referring to the diverse swath of human civilization from the Americas and beyond as the Christian world. Nevertheless, the terms the Muslim world and the Muslim community have really come to occupy the field here, and this is new. This is a relatively recent development. And I was really interested to read an article by Salah Bashir, who problematizes this term, the Muslim community, as, in his view, a European invention that collapses all of the diversity in a population originating in countries from Indonesia all the way across to Morocco and beyond. This same deconstruction, I think, can be applied to the all too common term, the Muslim world, as well. I mean, I think, in fact, there's some ironic parallels here. This sort of echoes the kind of vision of the Ummah, or international community of Muslims, that is now in particular championed so strongly by fundamentalists. And the use, or the easy use of this terminology, I've begun to describe as kind of the Ummah of the Western imagination. I do think it describes, some reality of some common feeling that some people may have, but it also hides a lot of the complexity. And I'm doing some of that myself today, too, talking about a very specific contextual problem in a very general way in a short space of time. So anyway, the terminology here is very difficult. I will do my best, perhaps using terms like Muslim population instead of community and so on.